right, so our presentation is on the paradigms of childhood in Peru, colonial model, Andean child rearing approaches. So the colonial views on indigenous people. In the reading, it read, colonizers commonly compare the people they have conquered and colonized children. In Viceroyalty of Peru, for example, Hispanic authorities both state Celestial frequently characterized native Andeans as childlike or even childish. End quote. Indigenous adults were seen as uncivilized and even childlike. The conquering of indigenous land was seen as a blessing for the indigenous people. With the conquering of their land, Spanish conquerors were teaching them a proper civilized way of living. Infantilization. So the use of infantilization was a method to justify the marginalization of the Andean people. This allowed for the continued conquering of many lands without much resistance from colonial people. If the adults are seen as unruly children, it would be much easier to justify any racialized methods of suppression. The use of infantilization was further enhanced by the ideologies of the church, and these ideologies were portrayed onto the Andean children. This question I ask you is, do you think the colonizers believed that they were keeping civilized life, or do you see it as a known lie to justify the conquering of indigenous land? Or methods of infantilization enhancing the ideas that these people needed saving? So the church's influence on children. In the reading, it states, furthermore, the children were seen as irrational, incapable, and in need of management. Having childlike tendencies in colonial times was seen as unruly and sinful. So the only possible way to save these children was by teaching the ways of a good Christian and to punish those who disobeyed. The question I ask you is, do you see that the church's views directly influence colonization and the marginalization of indigenous people? Or were colonizers using the church as justification for their actions?
So Taft also mentions many of the proposed changes to the law limited children's rights by saying that they had these rights only with the authorization or supervision of their parents. In response, many of the children in the movement felt that the adults were reverting back to the older ways and ideas of thinking. They viewed these proposed changes as them losing their protections rather than gaining. The participants also seen it as a tactic the adults were using in order to gain back power and control by essentially implying that children are unable to make rational decisions for themselves and they still needed the supervision of adults. Barriers that some of the children in Peru still faced were that although they were making progression for the people that were involved in the movements concerning their rights, adults and policymakers are still hesitant on allowing children to hold power in social and political spaces. These pushbacks from adults, children will be continued to be viewed as objects rather than contributing subjects in social, political, and economic spaces. So a question that we do have is, do you think that adults, policymakers have reason to stick to the older ways of thinking, or is it just a way for adults to keep control and power over children? So overall, Andean children and adults were childlike and uncivilized people who needed to be educated in the morals of good Christian behavior. Infantilization was a strategy used to marginalize the Andean people and allowed conquest to take effect in many lands without battling. Not only was it a technique used by colonial people, but Andean children were also taught infantilization in schools Throughout Peruvian political and social life, the childhood model persists by obtaining rights only with the consent and control over their guardians. Adults and policymakers believe that kids have too many rights and are trying to restore adult power and authority, and that children are a mess and they need strong laws and strong hands to control them. Consequently, in social and political life, children would continue to be treated as objects rather than subjects.